Tonight we're very honored to have Richard Branson, who needs no introduction, but I will ask Richard to tell the audience a little bit about himself. And Ventilation Matters is thrilled to have Richard Branson here to talk about closed loop ventilation. So Richard, if you will take it away.
Sure. So my name's Rich Branson. I'm a respiratory therapist. I have spent the last 40 years at the University of Cincinnati, going from a respiratory therapist in the hospital to my current position as professor in the Department of Surgery. Over those years, I've been in charge of critical care research, run an animal lab, run a bench lab for studying ventilators. I've written 2 books and published over 300 papers in PubMed. I have a particular interest in closed loop control of mechanical ventilation, have for a long time. And my plan is to do a presentation today that isn't so much rah-rah, but more is about important questions. And this is based on some work that I did with FDA on what their concerns are. So if that's okay with you guys, I'll share my screen here and we'll get started. See it okay?
Yep, it's fine.
Okay. So again, I'm a respiratory therapist. I have my graduate degrees in research, clinical research. And I also have a adjunct appointment at the Air Force School of Aerospace Medicine in Dayton, Ohio. I should probably at least do my disclosures. I do have research support or consulting with Mallinckrodt, Ventec, Bayer, and Zoll, and Pfizer as well. So I think if we're going to talk about this, and again, you guys interrupt me anytime you want. The first question we have to ask ourselves is what's the problem that closed loop control of ventilation is going to fix? And when I say closed loop control of ventilation, I mean control rate, tidal volume, airway pressures, PEEP, FiO2, the whole kit and caboodle. So where do we have shortcomings? Well, sometimes we have trouble maintaining gas exchange. Sometimes we have trouble with lung protection. Asynchrony is clearly a problem, and one that really so far hasn't been well addressed in terms of closed loop control of ventilation. We'd like to get patients discontinued from the ventilator quicker. There are issues about lung recruitment, both how to do it and who to do it in. We want to avoid complications of mechanical ventilation, which can, we had a retirement for one of the surgeons I worked with this morning. And in 36 years of working together, we were talking about how back in 1980, 81, 82, it was not unusual to have patients with 6 or 7 chest tubes and them constantly be bubbling. And, but everybody's getting, if you're a normal person, you got a liter tidal volume. If you're obese, you got 1.2. And if you're a little old lady, you got 800. So times have changed. But barotrauma isn't that big a problem anymore. Volutrauma still is, and of course, hemodynamic consequences. And monitoring, how do we know that the patient's doing better? So let's ask those questions. So what could closed loop control actually do? Well, I think it's very clear that if you have a system that is based on rules, you can reduce practice variation. And there's probably something to be said for that. But I think one of the things we need to remember as people who tend to be proponents of closed loop control is you can provide people closed loop control, but if they're going to put everybody on APRV, it just doesn't matter. Or if they're going to decide they're going to put people on some kind of high frequency ventilation, reducing practice variation with closed loop isn't going to help. So a lot of this starts with the education of the people at the bedside. Closed loop control could enhance safety, both through monitoring and alerting you of changes in the patient's condition. It can respond to changes in the patient condition when given staffing ratios and severity of illness, the caregivers can't. And clearly, I mean, on a number of occasions since COVID-19 has started, when I've been on the phone with people at FDA, I've kind of been nudging them in the ribs going, hey, wouldn't it be great if we had closed loop control of at least FiO2 now? And we wouldn't have to put on PPE every time we had to go in and turn the FiO2 up. Yeah. I don't know if that's gonna change their opinion at all. But clearly, we'll get to that because that's actually my biggest feeling about closed loop ventilation is it's most valuable when you are in a situation where you don't have experts, where you don't have physicians, attending physicians, fellows, residents, respiratory therapists, and other people who are worried about it. There's some suggestion that ventilator discontinuation can be facilitated with closed loop control. Again, escalation of therapy, might also be important. But I think the last one is the one that always has stood out for me, which is provide the standard of care regardless of the environment and the caregiver. I'm sure you guys have seen the things I see, and I know this from other work that we've done. There are 1,000 critical access hospitals in the United States of America, and critical access hospitals are usually less than 25 beds. They are not subject to the reimbursement by Medicare under DRG and things like that. So they get a higher payment because they're small hospitals and they can't sustain, but they're generally the first place that people in rural areas come to. Well, when we did the survey of ventilators back, I think in 2010, most critical access hospitals don't have a single ventilator. And now we see people sending them ventilators, but they don't have anybody who knows how to use them. And in that case, having a ventilator that does closed loop control, that's with a validated algorithm, could be a real advantage in those groups and those patients until they can be transferred where they have the expertise that's required. And not to be self-congratulatory, in fact, it hasn't been, but I was interviewed in the New York Times yesterday and said, the problem is not ventilators, the problem is people to operate them and care for the patient. And I think that's still gonna be our biggest limitation. So again, I don't want to point anybody out in particular. Rob and I have thought about and worked on these problems for a long time. Closed loop controls in everything. I mean, every pressure mode of ventilation is closed loop control. The flow is being servo controlled to maintain the pressure, but nobody thinks of it like that. Mandatory minute volume has been around since the 70s, initially a completely a system without computers, just a system that didn't require any kind of real feedback mechanism. Adaptive pressure control, again, whatever you want to call it, PRVC, APV, auto flow, depending on whose ventilator you make. Adaptive support ventilation has been around a very long time now. Auto mode, similar to ASV, has been around for a long time. PAV, NAVA are types of closed loop systems, just kind of ongoing within a breath closed loop. Smart care pressure support with the Draeger devices, and outside of the US and elsewhere, IntelliVent, that includes ASV plus closed loop control of FiO2 and PEEP and closed loop control of FiO2 that we've been doing in, again, specifically for military situations and transport. And then the groups at Vyaire initially doing CLIO for closed loop control in neonates, which makes perfect sense to me. I still can't believe that's not FDA approved. So again, just for the other people that are on the call, what are the things that people who aren't, again, when we're not thinking about the cutting edge and we want to see this happen, what are the things that people are worried about? They're worried about usability. How easy are these to use? How do you monitor what's happening? How do you assess the patient? And then FDA really has a concern with over-reliance and complacency by the staff. Okay, I don't have to worry about what the ventilator's doing because the ventilator's taking care of it. We often have had the discussion, on rounds in the morning. Generally speaking, somebody will say, what are the ventilator settings? Well, they've been ordered, so most everybody knows. But in closed loop control, you won't know what the ventilator settings are until you look at the ventilator at that particular period of time. And I think the other thing is how do we evaluate these devices and what are relevant clinical inputs? I'm going to tell you, and again, all due respect to people that are friends of ours or colleagues of ours, the work by Jean-Michel Arnal that shows that you don't have to interface with the ventilator as often, and that's an advantage, isn't necessarily an advantage. It's not an advantage to the patient. If you're trying to get FDA approval, having the staff pay less attention to a device isn't necessarily going to give you an advantage. I mean, I understand it. I understand perfectly why you do that. I mean, when we did our closed loop FiO2 control, in 4 hours, the ventilator changes the FiO2 on the average of like 50 times, whereas the staff changed it 2 times. So the question is, does that matter? Training of the staff is important. Using simulation to train the staff will be important. In terms of human factors, usabilities, how do you set the goals? How do you set the alarms? Is the SpO2 goal different for the COPD patient than the head injured patient than the patient with heart failure? How will they know, the caregivers know the level of device support versus the patient contribution? How will the caregiver be alerted of decline in patient physiology? And if you'll excuse me for just one story, we're sitting in front of FDA at the FDA headquarters, and we're discussing a patient, and one of my colleagues says, look at this graph. We had this patient, and all of a sudden the closed loop FiO2 increased his FiO2 markedly, and it prevented him from ever being hypoxemic, but his oxygen requirement increased by 30% over a short period of time. And this is like 2 or 3 o'clock in the afternoon. And at 11 o'clock that night, the patient still, study was over, the patient still required excess oxygen, wasn't responsive to PEEP. So we took him to CT, and of course he had a saddle pulmonary embolism. Now, what do you take from that story? I'll let you guys, can you guys talk?
Yeah, oxygen is a good monitor.
What FDA took from that story was, oh, the closed loop system preventing you from diagnosing the problem earlier. So that literally turned into a several weeks of work for us to develop a way to monitor every time this happened so that the bedside staff could say, the FiO2 went up because of blah, 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 blah. And again, so sometimes we say things as clinicians that make sense that regulatory people go, that doesn't make any sense to us. And not having to interface with the ventilator and not knowing when the patient's going to have an increased oxygen requirement is a problem. So we built into the system now, if the FiO2 changes more than a certain percentage over a certain period of time, you get not an alarm, but you get an alert, you know, a yellow light that says, hey, come look at me because something's going on. Again, assessment, how will we monitor what's going on? Again, I think closed loop control reduces the number of times I got to turn the knobs. It increases the number of times I need to look at what's going on with the patient. And that might be good. I think that's a positive. But over-reliance and complacency is a real concern within FDA anyway, and with regulatory bodies here in the US. And again, just not to show you things, you guys, this is starting to be really old at this point. But a really good example is the whole volume support example. So this is a study that Samir Abair did very early in his career, looking at standard pressure support versus volume support. And they did a study that, quite frankly, couldn't be done in the United States of America because it would not be of any, there'd be no benefit to the patient. So they put this big piece of dead space on the other side of the Y piece to stimulate the patients to breathe more aggressively. And when they did that, this is the increases from baseline value. So with pressure support, you kind of have the, you know, you get the same pressure every breath. But with volume support, the harder the patients worked, the lower the pressure dropped. And that, again, these are the kind of things that regulatory bodies look at with respect to these, what we tend to think as simple closed loop control systems. And again, I'm not going to belabor the point here, but here again is the changes in work of breathing in joules per minute from pressure support with the added dead space versus volume support with the added dead space. And you see that there's a significant difference. And this is something that, you know, we talked about, Rob and I know talked about in a paper when we used to call it dual control a long time ago. This is something you need to be aware of. And maybe you need to monitor P.1 at the same time, or maybe there's a volume monitoring that needs to go along with this. The paper by the groups from that work with Hamilton, I like to show this graph because I think it does two things very nicely. One is it shows you the tidal volume in mLs per kilo of ideal body weight for patients who are not breathing at all the patients, those not breathing it all together, all the patients not breathing, and all the patients who are active. And then there's the COPD patients, the normal patients, like if we have normal patients on the ventilator these days, and those with ARDS. The triangles represent the inspiratory and the expiratory time, which is a very clever way, I thought, of showing this data. So, you know, again, I always said, and I will still say, ASV is actually not all that sophisticated. Where it has where Joseph Brunner had his thought that was very important was measuring the expiratory time constant. So you can see here, so for the same issue, Here's the IE ratio, very fast inspiratory time for the COPD patients with a longer expiratory time. Whereas with the patients with ARDS, and let's just look at the middle ones where they're passive, more of a 1 to 1.5 or 1 to 2 IE ratio, as opposed to a, here you see almost 1 to 3, 1 to 4. But so that's one thing. So again, the expiratory time constant, critical component of closed loop for being able to ventilate patients with different pathologies. But over here is the other problem. And that's that once the patients start to trigger the ventilator, kind of a lot of the stuff that you can control just goes away. I mean, basically all you can control now is the pressure. So it just falls into being adaptive pressure ventilation. From a clinical standpoint, then we need, clinical studies, animal studies, computer simulations are critical. I can tell you that FDA feels like no closed loop control system is ever going to be approved in America unless somebody has done a very sophisticated computational modeling that the very smart engineers at FDA can understand, even though they can't understand the basic simple things about clinical care of the ventilated patient. And again, what are the relevant endpoints? Safety. Does it reduce the incidence of hypoxemia? Does it reduce the number of alarms? Does it reduce complications? Does it keep patients in a normal zone? And we've seen that data reported on a number of times. I'm going to try to be done here in a few minutes so we can just have a discussion. Again, will it reduce time on the ventilator? The closed loop control, in my opinion, is never going to reduce mortality because all it does is just do what we would do. I just don't see it as something that's going to really further decrease why patients die, because patients don't die because of the ventilator these days. IntelliVent, I'm not going to bore you guys to death with this. So in IntelliVent, again, very simple. They just basically took the PEEP FiO2 table from ARDSNet ARMA, which was the 6 mL versus 12 mL per kilo trial, and to climb up, so fast increase in FiO2 up and slow increase in PEEP. And then they used the PEEP FiO2 table from ARDSNet alveoli on the way down. So fast reduction in FiO2, slow reduction in PEEP. Makes perfect sense. It actually kind of, again, I don't know whose idea it was, although we did a very similar thing when we did this and we're unaware that they were doing it. But it makes sense because you basically have 2 trials with close to 1,600 patients had these methods used and it had been proven to be safe and efficacious with no difference between the 2. So you see this paper from anesthesiology, again, getting to be a little bit old at this point, looking at patients, individual patients at the bottom, and then showing you the times they're either in or out, in this case, out of range. So in yellow, the respiratory rates are greater than 35. So patient 4 spends 40% of his time with a respiratory rate greater than 35. You have a few patients with slow respiratory rates and a number of patients with tidal volumes that are smaller than 5 mL per kilo, and occasionally somebody more than 12 mL per kilo. Same patients on IntelliVent, that really changes. Although one of the criticisms of all the ASV and IntelliVent trials is it does allow, if you're not careful how you set it, much larger tidal volumes than maybe you'd like to see. 12 mL per kilo in this case, in this patient, more than 50% of the time. So again, same groups, looking at very similar data that we saw before, looking at tidal volume with patients who have normal lungs, patients with ARDS, and patients with COPD. And again, you see with these, semi box and whisker plots, you can see that some of these patients are getting fairly high tidal volumes in mLs per kilo. And we need to know what that means and how to prevent it. And here's the data for FiO2, again, showing you if you have closed loop control of ventilation, you often can very easily maintain FiO2. And again, this just show you the data again, another paper by Jean-Michel. The Europeans take a totally different view of this stuff than they do in the United States, since Jean-Michel has his own practice, but also works for Hamilton Medical. And I realize we always have to worry about those conflicts of interest. But here again, in their study, you see a number of times where you have a very large tidal volume. Again, I like these graphs. We've done these graphs with our data. So here's end-tidal CO2 with ASV versus IntelliVent. And you have an idea of how adding IntelliVent, which uses end-tidal CO2 to make some of the changes, shows a change in the minute ventilation, the change in the end-tidal CO2, and how the effects on both FiO2 and PEEP are made much more frequently, obviously, in IntelliVent than ASV, where it's still controlled by the clinician. So let me finish then, just say training of the staff. How's industry going to train the staff? What type of training is going to be required? Are they going to have to understand and do simulation? I think that could be really important going forward. Just real quickly, again, people always say, oh, well, it reduces, closed loop control reduces the variability in patient control. And I know things have changed since then, but this adaptive servo ventilation, completely different than ASV for treating patients who get periodic breathing associated with heart failure, mostly get chain Stokes. They do this adaptive servo ventilation, and sure enough, it reduced the number of chain Stokes events they had, but it didn't change their apnea-hypopnea index, and it increased their cardiovascular mortality. So again, sometimes, you know, if we've learned nothing else in my lifetime of working in critical care, chasing physiologic endpoints can sometimes and oftentimes are detrimental to patients. So there's been some data, you know, shorter duration of care with smart care and pressure support in ASV, but almost always in cardiac surgery, where I still submit that if you just walk in and say, who wants to be extubated, everybody who can raise their hand can be extubated. You don't have to have closed loop control. Reduce clinical intervention, all of them do that, but I don't know that that's an advantage. Again, I've said some of these things, but we'll just move on forward. So, but I think at this point, unfortunately, there still are no large trials that demonstrate superiority. Now, just this past week, the Bob Kasmerick and Jesus Villar published a paper in Intensive Care Medicine suggesting that NAVA reduced the time for adults on mechanical ventilation by 35%. That data is kind of old, and it's taken them a long time to get it to press, but you know, take that for what it's worth. I think there's no doubt that NAVA reduces asynchrony. I'm just not sure that there's a benefit to that necessarily, unfortunately. Certainly reducing practice variation is important. Resource limited environments like we're experiencing right now are closed loop control is almost a perfect answer for, but where the patients are, the standards of care, and what you compare it to is obviously important. And I also think, I mean, Rob, maybe this can be the first thing we can talk about, but I would be shocked if the physicians at the Cleveland Clinic think the answer to any problem they have right now is closed loop control of ventilation and letting the ventilator make the decisions instead of them. I mean, when I go to the ICU and say, what are your 10 biggest problems? People list off their 10 biggest problems. Needing closed loop ventilation is never in that top 10 list. But maybe that's because that's not what they're focused on. So again, I'm going to just end there and say that right now, these systems promise improved outcomes, but haven't proven that.
There we go.
Well, thanks for coming, Ross.
Thanks for that, Richard. It was really informative. I've got a couple of questions that I could ask. I'm on call, so I'm sorry, I might have to get you away, but I only heard half your presentation, so they'll be pretty uninformed. Entitled CO2 monitoring, we were having a lot of trouble with ours. Just the CO2 gradient is huge in critically ill patients. And my concern is that sometimes it goes up, the CO2 goes down because the ventilation's better, and sometimes it goes down because the VQ mismatch is worse. And I wondered if we're using it to monitor ventilation, how do we deal with that? And does that, it causes some problems, I know, but.
Well, I think, again, my opinion, end-tidal CO2 should not be used as a target, but more as a guide rails.
Yeah.
So, you know, I would never want to chase the end-tidal CO2 number and increase and decrease the respiratory rate, because just like you said, decreased cardiac output and the end-tidal CO2 is down significantly. And that's, you know, one of the problems I have with IntelliVent is, you know, changing PEEP PEEP is really the difficult one, right? Because in COPD, I want to add PEEP because I want to overcome auto PEEP, and I really want to avoid overdistension. In ARDS, I want to add PEEP because I want to provide retain the recruitment that I've done. In other patients, I may want to use PEEP for a different reason. And in patients with cardiac disease, I may want to be really careful with how I use PEEP. And right now, there's no good way for the ventilator to have information. And I'll tell you, so again, most of my work with closed loop is dedicated for military use. So our goal is to have the ventilator and the bedside physiologic monitor connected together so that we can see the heart rate, the blood pressure, other indices of how the patient's doing from a cardiac performance standpoint. And literally, if we believe the PEEP needs to be changed, is have a window come up that says, suggest increase PEEP to 10. And then the person at the bedside has to go, oh, okay, I'll do that, and press the button because the mean arterial pressure is more than 70 and the systolic pressure is more than 120. I don't know, pick your numbers. But yeah, I agree. End-tidal CO2 is always a problem. We put end-tidal CO2 in the ventilators, and maybe I don't think it's different. In the States, where there are less anesthesiologists in charge of critical care, end-tidal CO2 rarely gets used in intensive care unit. If I were to go into my surgical ICU and put end-tidal CO2 in all the ventilators, within 8 hours, they'd all be out because the therapist would take them out because they're giving information that in their mind isn't useful, and they're alarming because they're wet from the humidifiers.
Yep.
Rich, I'd like to respond to your comment about physicians not thinking that closed loop is top on their list of priorities. I would agree with that, but not for the reason that you imply. The reason is that they simply don't understand it. And the proof is we have some very sophisticated, very new ventilators that have advanced modes that have a certain amount of closed loop control, and that's not used. And the only reason it's not used is nobody's familiar with it, or very few people are familiar with it. And even if you get a well-trained intensivist that knows exactly what the ventilator is doing, puts it on in the daytime, at nighttime, somebody takes it off because they're uncomfortable with it, right? And I don't have to sell this to you guys. That's the problem. And you can make the argument that, well, a well-trained intensivist manually could do anything that automation can do, and probably better. Absolutely true, if they're standing at the bed 24/7, which they cannot do. And I'll take that a step further and say, have you ever picked a patient on a ventilator, just looked at his whole course of mechanical ventilation over, let's say a sick patient, a week and a half, looked at every single change that the ventilator was made, tried to figure out what in the hell was going through that person's mind when they made that change? And every time I've done it, I've just gotten frustrated because there's no rhyme or reason what they do. They change the modes, they change the settings. It's like they're rolling the dice. So if for no other reason, if you took an advanced mode that has some intelligence built into it and some automation that did the kind of things that you said, kept the patient safe, or chose appropriate settings, decreased the amount of discordance between the ventilator and the patient, then all those things would not have to occur at random at the hands of a variety of people, have all different skill levels. So if nothing else, it's more efficient. Possibly it could impact patient outcomes. But proving that, like you said, is damn near impossible, right?
Sure, but the other problem is, what makes you think that when they're on closed loop control, those same people aren't going to go up there and change, the variables? They're going to go up there and change what the end-tidal CO2 they're going to tolerate. They're going to go up and change what minute volume they're going to tolerate.
But then that's not really closed loop, is it? They're overriding the design.
I
grant you, that's probably what happened.
Again, I'm not there that often anymore, but my frustration is when you're at the bedside and you ask those questions. Well, why did you do that? And you get the answer, well, I felt like. How you feel has nothing to do with what we're doing here.
That's my point exactly. That's my point exactly. And we do what we call ventilator rounds every week or every other week. And it's open to anyone. And it was designed primarily for the fellows. And we take them to the bedside. Well, we could before the COVID did. And now we show them screenshots. We say, what do you see? Tell us what the mode is. Tell us what the interaction with the patient is. What do you think is wrong? Are these the right settings? What would you do better? And it's taken literally 10 years to build up a knowledge base where you feel that kind of errors that you're mentioning is decreased.
Yeah, we used to do that all the time too. Actually, we did it, when Bob Campbell and I worked together in the afternoons, going around and doing rounds with the fellows and the residents in the ICU. But again, if you have a perfect solution that nobody will use, it's not really a perfect solution.
Yeah, I give you that.
So
like
it sounds
said.
like
Go ahead.
I was going to say, it sounds like what we need to do is figure out a step that can bring engagement at the bedside for people to understand things. I'll give you a perfect example. For me, FiO2 control is no different than a physician walking up and writing an order in the chart that says, keep FiO2 between this range and it's above this at this step change, for that period of time. And that same script could be incorporated easily into the controls of a ventilator so that people are engaged in this closed loop event. There's a lot of things that we do in terms of closing signals and controlling valves and those sorts of things that could be considered by engineers closed loop. But I think what we're talking about is closing the loop between care and those who are delivering care in a way that the device is facilitating our move towards these objectives, whether it's work of breathing, whether it's oxygenation, or what have you. And so my question is, in this intermediate step, there's certainly things that the ventilator knows ahead of the caregiver that you mentioned, I believe, Richard, related to awareness, alerts versus action. The ventilator doesn't necessarily have to take action, but what it can do is it can alert. A perfect example of that would be changes in static compliance to dynamic compliance. And does that mean that we should be looking at airway secretions? Does that look like, those sorts of guiding things to engage the therapist, to educate the therapist, to bring the team in, I think might be one of the first steps. Maybe that'll let regulators feel comfortable that the human is still involved. But to me, when I hear human factors to me means that the device doesn't represent itself in a way that causes me to make an error. To me, that's the essence of what I want out of human factors. I want to know that I can set up a device and make it do what I think it's intended to do without having to read the manual, because that's who we are. We're not going to read the manuals. So those are the areas I wonder if we should spend more attention to.
I mean, again, I think closed loop control of FiO2 is the lowest possible hanging fruit. I will tell you that I do believe that FDA in particular, if the ventilator is changing an output based on an input that's measured by the ventilator, they don't seem to have much trouble with it. So if I'm going to change the pressure based on the exhaled tidal volume or the inspired tidal volume, they're kind of like, oh, okay. But the second you take an input from something else, the oximeter or the physiologic monitor, and now you want to use those, the interoperability comes into play. But, and again, we've been doing closed loop ventilation. I'm embarrassed to say I've been enrolling patients in closed loop FiO2 for 12 years to try and get an FDA approval. Now, there were a lot of times we weren't enrolling because we were in a regulatory wrestling match. But yeah, the place where closed loop FiO2 control to me makes the most sense is in the neonatal ICU, where I never work. I mean, it makes so much sense. But then, then something like the support trial comes out that I think Wally Carlo was in charge of. And when they pick a target of 90% or 89%, now, the patients have greater incidence of hypoxemia and greater incidence of neurocognitive delay. And then all of a sudden the FDA goes, whoa, that closed FiO2 is a lot more complicated than we thought.
How is it that we live in a world where a physician can get to work in a car that drives itself, but he can't use a ventilator, a little box to change its own FiO2? You can only kill one person at a time with a ventilator. You could do much better with a car.
Again, I've always tried to use the analogy with FDA that closed loop FiO2 is like a thermostat for oxygen. And they always get very frustrated because they go, it's so much more complicated than that. Underneath, you have to worry about cardiac output and perfusion, and you have to worry about VQ matching and, you know, how these things change. And I go, all that's absolutely true. But you know what? Every day, all over the world, people look up at the monitor and see what the SpO2 is, and they walk over and increase or decrease the FiO2. It's exactly the same. I mean, I get it. And you see some of these really, the Nottingham model that they've done for physiology, which is just, you know, incredible work. But you know what? In the end, every day, the standard of care is I measure the pulse oximetry reading and I change the FiO2, or I change the PEEP, and then I draw blood gas. It's the same for the ventilators, but I don't know how we get to that point. I did see that, was it just a couple of weeks ago, FDA gave Hamilton some kind of status, you know, emerging technology. Yeah, gave it emerging status technology, which I believe maybe perhaps speeds their way towards some type of approval at some point. I don't know.
Yeah,
So
once
again,
it opens the floodgates, right? Because then it's 510K all the way, right?
I didn't hear them say 510K.
Oh no, I'm saying that if
Yeah.
they do, right? If they do.
Yeah, that might actually be a de novo status that allows something that, you know, you don't push to PMA. It gives it
Yeah.
a path. And then once that's there in marketing, then all the rest can 510K their way as predicates or as substantially equivalent.
So if I can jump in. Rich, you showed on your presentation a long list of closed loop modes or functions. These have been around, most of them around 20 years plus, right? And yet, you know, a few of us have been very actively involved in their development, but the bulk of those have never taken off. I mean, MMV, or even we'll say smart care, or whatever, or, you know, all these modes, nothing wrong with them, but these have not taken off. And yet clinicians have them on their vents, and they'll still go back and use PCV, VCV, and they just haven't somehow embraced technology, or the education system is not teaching them the benefits in certain patients. And the point you brought up about synchrony, I mean, that's a classical one where people would never, they will fiddle with the pressure support level, but never think about the expiratory termination criteria. It's 25%. And, you know, maybe it should be 40% or 60%, because no one's got a clue what to do, right?
Well, that's part of the problem, right? I mean, I've been frustrated. We just published a paper in Chest about all the ventilators that were purchased for the COVID epidemic.
Yep.
Some of them, which are absolutely completely useless for care of a patient with ARDS. And when I try to explain these things, I realize that people just don't understand. I mean, Rob, you know, probably more frustrated than me. You know, we've both written books on mechanical ventilation and multiple papers apart and together. And the average, and I don't want to call them out. So there was a paper in Chest recently during COVID-19 where the physicians were, once they realized this was a viral respiratory illness, they were really worried about aerosol generating procedures. So they turned the heated humidifiers off in intubated patients to prevent any rain out in the circuit. And then they noted that they had a lot of plugged endotracheal tubes after that. Sheesh. And so then you have to, again, I get it. You know, they were swamped. They were totally overrun. They didn't know what they were dealing with. They were trying to make changes on the run, but the simple basics of ventilation are lost on a lot of people.
Well, the problem is education, like Graeme said. You know, I think you guys would agree that most of the education that happens in the world, it doesn't occur in schools. It's provided by manufacturers, clinical specialists, and they all have their own personal biases. There's no standardization. You can go anywhere in the world and get the same CPR training. You can get the same scuba training, for Christ's sake, but you cannot get two schools in the same city to teach mechanical ventilation the same way. That is the fundamental root of our problem.
Well, again, Graeme being on that side of the fence, I guess, the ventilator manufacturers are not in the business of teaching people principles and why two ventilators are similar. They're in the business of teaching why theirs is different
Yeah,
and
product
why
differentiation.
theirs is better.
Yeah.
And I mean, I'd love to do it. I don't know if there's a paper out of Holland that looks at the use of closed loop controlled ventilation in the Netherlands. And they virtually don't use it at all.
Right.
Whereas, I mean, Graeme, you used to work with Hamilton, but in Singapore, I get the impression the people who have Hamiltons use ASV all the time. No, my experience in the United States is, and Hamilton's a much larger player than they used to be. I think, I'm sure they think it's because they did something special. I think a lot of it is the other companies just fell off. I don't have any idea what Medtronic is doing.
Yeah.
Nothing new with the ventilator business, until Vyaire picked up IMT, they were kind of, stuck with the Avia for the last 20 years.
Yeah, and
So,
Medtronic put all their money into Nava.
Yeah. Or McKay. Yeah. So you have, I always think that there's a window of opportunity for any ventilator company where they can jump in because there's a dearth of changes by anybody else. And just by being new gives you a lot of advantage. But when Rob, we should do this and survey, respiratory care departments around the country and say, do you have closed loop ventilation? Do you have, smart care pressure support? Do you have ASV? And how often do you use it? And I guarantee it's less than 5%. I used to tell Doug DeVries back with the LTV days, we need a black box in the ventilator, which I guess we have now, that would tell us how many times somebody used a function that they said they wouldn't buy the ventilator unless it had it. I won't buy this if I can't have APRV. And then you sell it to them and they use APRV twice.
I've been through that 3 times formally. An analysis to spend millions of dollars on ventilators, and you hear that argument all the time, and it plays out just like you said.
Hey Ross, you're involved running the basic course around the world, right? You teach ventilation.
Yeah.
So what's the feedback like from these countries you go to? I mean, you go here with.
Yeah. So Richard's comment about the ventilator companies aren't interested in teaching anything except what their ventilator does so well is a common theme. It's difficult because the ventilators to teach are simple, but they're all so different, and I found it always challenging if you've got a Hamilton, you're trying to teach them about a Draeger. They've got Draegers at home, and you're teaching on a Hamilton, or the other way around. It's difficult to explain the difference, and it creates more confusion. And I can understand why you take a military approach. This is what you will do. This is how this ventilator works. We all have the same ventilators. It'd be easy. I was going to make a comment about automated ventilation and just really not detracting from Hamilton's ASV, but some of the units in New Zealand now have adopted ASV as their go-to mode, and we certainly decided to do that if we had a COVID crisis, which never eventuated, but that was going to be our starting mode. But some of the hospitals now use ASV almost exclusively, and it dumbs down the clinicians, which is a good thing perhaps, but they don't know how to get themselves out of trouble. They can't fix a ventilation problem, apart from ECMO. Sometimes they say put them on ECMO. The ASV doesn't work, put them on ECMO. But there's no, they aren't taught, and there's certainly juniors aren't taught the fundamentals of good ventilation practice. They just put them on ASV, and then they turn one knob up and down, maybe 2 knobs.
That happens with automation and everything. People argue that happens with autopilots on planes. Everywhere you
yeah,
go.
yes, it's the same thing. Yeah, it's yeah. Get someone who knows how to use the manual. It's the manual car. I always tell people about ventilation. I've got a Land Rover. It's a manual, and it was really good because when my kids were learning to drive, they wouldn't touch my car because they'd always take Mum's car because it was an automatic, and left my one alone. And so it's a bit like that people know how to drive the automatic, but wouldn't touch the manual. So
We saw it also in spirometry where talk about a water seal spirometer and pull off the graph and start plotting your FEV1s. People look at you like you're crazy. They just want, the number and want a spoon fed what the number means. And
We're old
you know.
enough to remember the days before there was a computer, much less an automated spirometry system.
Unfortunately,
Well, again, I really the mechanical ventilation issues are in part with closed loop is lack of situational awareness. But I think it's true. I tell this story all the time. It's been years ago now, 6 or 7 years ago anyway. They asked me to come see a patient in neurosurgical ICU doing terrible on the ventilator. I walk in, the family's in the room. The lady's like 4'2", and she was grocery shopping. She came home, sat down at the table, and probably had a stroke or intraventricular hemorrhage and then fell over, vomited. Son found her. They brought her in. And I walk in there and I'm observing from the back of the room. I'm not smarter than anybody else that's in there. But I look at this lady who's 4'2" and look at her tidal volume of 500 and I say, that's probably a little bit large. Why don't we back off on the tidal volume? And then I look up and I see, I think this was a Draeger ventilator, which gives you resistance and compliance right on the screen. And the resistance is 26 centimeters of water per liter per second. And I look at the young respiratory therapist and I say, wow, the resistance is really high. Have you checked the HME? Is it occluded? Does it have mucus in it? How do you know the resistance is high? I said, it's 26 centimeters of water per liter per second. And she looks at me and she says, is that what that R is for? So then I try to do the thing that unfortunately these days the residents and other people refer to as pimping. And I tell everybody, what's resistance? What units is it? What's a normal resistance? What's an abnormal resistance? Nobody knows. So if they don't know how to calculate it or what a normal value is, how can we possibly expect them to make a change? So we took the HME out of line. It had a lot of secretions in it, put it back, still like 15. I thought, damn. So I look at her son and I say, Mom have asthma? Well, she had it, but she outgrew it. Well, then we give her a couple of puffs of albuterol, and now our airway resistance is 9 centimeters of water per liter per second. And with the lower tidal volume, and everything starts to come out. I don't know how closed loop ventilation, FiO2, PEEP, no matter what you do, I don't know how you take that entire, I'm not sure what I even am coming up with the right term, but how do you take all this extrapolation of this data from multiple points and come out with the answer? And I'm not sure that anything but a human brain is capable of doing that.
That's called artificial general intelligence, Rich. That's the direction we're heading. We're not there yet. I think computers and artificial intelligence and computers are just smart enough to get themselves into trouble. But the day will come when a machine can do what you just said.
I show my ignorance here, but I've been hearing how great big data is going to be. Big data is going to solve all our problems. Big data is a big mess because the people at the very bottom who are inputting the data don't know what they're doing. So you have a bunch of crap that's big data and that people want to make decisions on.
Yep.
Garbage in, garbage out, huh? Well, I think another example is with the ventilators. You raised the issue of the ventilators purchased for COVID, and even some of the ventilators developed. We saw ambu bags, and knowing the international world ambu bag depression device, someone asked me what would happen if that was, donated internationally, and I told them they would look at it and go, "Damn good, an ambu bag. Now, how do I get it out of this box? Or how do I get it out of this thing?" Because the reality is, as a therapist, you take away ambu bag from me. I mean, it's therapeutic, but it's also diagnostic. I'm feeling that resistance. I'm feeling that inflation. I'm looking at, you're a diagnostic being and you're a therapeutic being, which is something simply, you're capable to act upon that. So it's not, it's not easily replaced by machines at this point, but it is, we know that machines can provide data, can recognize patterns, can respond to patterns. All those things can happen faster, and response time, care response time can theoretically be improved. But we just have to apply it in the right way to solve what you said to start this whole talk, which is
Well, I think,
solve a problem.
yeah, I think, again, given this, because I've spent a lot of time with it, I think that the heartwarming story of COVID-19 is all these very smart people who put all their talents to developing ventilators that can be easily built and used. They're absolutely useless and nobody wants them, but it's a really nice story. And I don't care if that's the guy from MIT who I've been on Zoom calls with, and he's a PhD professor at MIT, and I'm sure he's 10 times smarter than I am, but his bag squeezing ventilator is useless. And I'm on a technical advisory group for the World Health Organization. And you know what the people in Africa say when we tell them we're going to send them more of these ventilators? They go, please don't send me more ventilators. Send me gloves. Send me sterile needles. Send me a reliable oxygen system and electricity. It's a classic case of people, of wealthy people, if you want to look at it that way. Now we say, resource limited countries. It's a classic case of wealthy people thinking they know what poor people or people who are less advantaged need, when in fact we don't. So I think, I don't know they're going to ship all those ventilators over there. Now there will be places that can tolerate them, but I'm trying to remember if it was Nigeria or one of the other countries where they have 4 critical care trained physicians in the whole country. Again, it doesn't matter how many ventilators we send them. All those patients also need a nurse and a therapist and a heated humidifier and sterile water and oxygen. It's a problem.
Where do we go from here? What are the recommendations for industry, for regulators, for caregivers as it relates to closed loop? Obviously, we don't have enough time to answer all those questions here, but certainly we'll keep asking those questions.
Well, I think the answer in the United States is you need to get, again, I've been critical of FDA, but the group that's there now tends to at least be amenable to meeting. So I think you sit down with FDA in a Q-sub meeting and you say, we want to get this technique approved. And you have a back and forth with them on what they'll accept as a outcome variable that they would grant you approval for your device. And you go through a couple iterations of that, and then you do a clinical trial. That's going to be very expensive. Again, Hamilton hasn't, to my knowledge, now it could be private, but I've never seen anything on clinicaltrials.gov. To my knowledge, Hamilton is not doing IntelliVent in the US in pursuit of an indication for use or approval in FDA. They might be, and I just don't know it. But I think, again, previously, I think they had hoped that they could just put all their data from European studies and studies from other parts of the world and just convince the FDA based on that. I don't think that's going to happen.
Why doesn't the FDA accept the fact that it's been used successfully outside the United States and safe?
The answer in one short word is thalidomide. So they believe that, I understand it's a drug, but the woman who didn't let thalidomide get brought into the US, they got a statue of her at FDA. She's very famous. She saved Americans from having babies with no arms and legs. So there's a real
attitude with COVID vaccine that comes out after a year trial.
Well, again, they're going to review the data. I bet every single one of those was tested in some place in the United States. But anyway, yeah, there are rules for drug trials that if the drug is only tested in Europe, FDA won't. You have to have at least a certain number of trials done in the United States. I would be very surprised. It could, things change, that FDA would approve a device based on data solely from outside the US. Now, maybe that means you can just do maybe you can do 50 patients in the US and just prove it's the same as the dozens of trials you've done outside the US. And that might be useful. But again, you sit down with FDA and you say, this is what we have. We propose to do a clinical trial that, with the outcome variable of, we're going to shorten length of stay. Don't pick that one, by the way, but if you want one, we're going to decrease the incidence of hypoxemia. We're going to increase the time in normoxemia and see if they'll buy it. And once they buy it, then you can go out and pursue your trial.
Is the reluctance driven by individuals, or is it a general policy you think of the whole FDA?
I think it's a general policy. I think, they're reticent. What's your job? I approve or I don't approve things. What's the reason I can get fired? I approve something that hurts people. Okay. What's the one way to guarantee I never do that? I never approve anything.
That's why we try
I
to
mean,
minimize type 1 errors in statistics, right? Those kind of errors
yes.
too much, too easily visible.
But again,
So,
I have been harsh on them, but I think, James Lee, who's the current bureau chief, some of the other people that are there are much more amenable, again, to having discussions. And that's the problem. I work with a number of companies who I say, well, just call FDA and have a meeting with them. Oh, no, we can't have a meeting with them. We don't want them to know what we're planning. Well, that's why you're never going to get anything approved. You have to sit down with them and have an honest conversation about what your device is and what you plan for it to do, and then see if they'll buy off. Or again, they'll tell you, well, you know what? We don't think that endpoint is the right endpoint, but if you could prove this, and we'd be able to do it. But again, with the work that we've done, we've had to go out and find people who can do computational modeling and just do Monte Carlo simulations, which to me means it's like gambling. Things that I quite frankly don't understand, but the MD, PhD, who's doing it, who went to school in Boston, understands all these, and they're worried about the corner cases, what happens out here and out here, not the easy ones in the middle. So I think it's possible, but it's a slog. And when I was talking about Hamilton before, my point was going to be, if I was Hamilton, would I spend $1 million to get IntelliVent approved in the US? Or would I spend, it's probably more than that. Would I spend $5 million or $10 million? No. Unless I could prove it was going to increase my sales, I'm not sure I'd even worry about it.
Yeah, especially now, the market is not there. I don't, these ventilators that were delivered, they were in the tens of thousands, 48,000 here, 50,000 there. I saw these purchases. I helped facilitate some of this stuff. And I can tell you that a CFO sitting in a hospital who's received 30 ventilators in his mind is not going to turn when the intensivist comes or the nurse manager or respiratory manager comes and says they have ventilators on their budget. So the ventilator business going forward is going to be difficult, and it's going to only be, the business is only going to be won by those people who engage their customers and support their customers and provide solutions, I think, that are simple. And it may even mean solutions that are already on the market, because the road is hard to get things cleared. Now, with that being said, I've had good experience with the FDA, and I know James Lee as well. I've had discussions with him, and I agree with you that what you need to do is avail yourself to that pre-sub, and you also have to not hold the FDA in any kind of reverence. That's the other problem I see. People who go in to meet with the FDA, they hold them in a reverence where they're afraid to disagree with them and say, you're wrong, and show me the law where it says I need to do this. Because we have statutes, we have limits to what they can request. And so you have to know your business. You have to know the regulatory game, and you have to know what you want to accomplish in that device's intended use and function. Now, where I was going with this is that if you think the FDA in the US is difficult, there's a big cloud over Europe. I was going to write an article called MedExit, because the medical device regulations are you think the CFRs are onerous. The MDRs are coming. They were postponed for a year. They said it was because no notified bodies would accept taking them on. The first one was BSI. They were resident to do that. Anyways, the entire world is going to be slow to approve things, and the pathway and the cost of doing business is going up, and the market is shrinking. So that's not a good forecast for the ventilator business. I hate to say it, but that doesn't spell doom and gloom. There are some bright spots in the U.S. Medical information who says it needs to be in the ventilator? That medical information that should be guiding caregivers to make the right steps doesn't have to be resident in some piece of the ventilator. It can be taken from the ventilator and put into another medical information system where you can make those decisions. So there's a lot of ways to, in fact, the ventilator is just valves and flow and sensors essentially, and gas metering, and why do we need a user interface if we're not going to have the users competent enough to deal with the user interface? Why do we need it? Why don't we just say to the machine, keep these parameters here and let it go? I mean, that's the ultimate in thinking of data out of the box, literally.
I think
Well,
you're
I
right.
think,
Go ahead, Rich.
well, just the one thing you said is things I've heard Graeme say before, which, and I'm not going to argue against, but again, does the average respiratory therapist at the bedside, and they don't even have respiratory therapists in Europe and parts of the rest of the world. They do some places, but mostly not. Your marketing strategy can't be, hey, you guys don't know what you're doing, so we've made a device to help fix the problem of your stupidity. Let me know how that goes. Let me know how the business goes.
It's the opposite.
Again, this is a real this is a huge challenge.
Yeah, I would agree. As much as I like to talk about artificial intelligence, I think we could do more good for humanity by just learning how to use the technology we already have to its maximum capability, rather than trying to find a silver bullet, the ideal mode that's going to solve these educational problems. It's basically an education and skill acquisition problem. We have not addressed that in any systematic way anywhere in the world.
I've been saying now for, I think, 15 or 20 years, don't give me a ventilator with a new mode. Don't give me a ventilator with a new, monitoring tool, the ISI, RSB, whatever it is. Give me a ventilator that, when the therapist comes up to it and says, I want to do this, and then it has a tutorial in it. It's, not something so complicated. And maybe it's even connected to the internet and you can link to PubMed and look at stuff if you want to look at it. But, and again, I've never really used this ventilator, but I see a lot of places now buying the new McKay ventilator, the servo ventilator. And my listening to them tell me why they buy it is the ease of use and, the kind of lesson learning from the device that they get, making it easier to use, the servo university kind of stuff. And I have no relationship with them whatsoever, but to me right now, that would be a bigger selling point for people. Again, I can't speak outside of the US, but in the US, a ventilator that helps the therapist do their job. Again, hey, the resistance is 26,
Yeah,
well,
exactly.
and then you push the button and you say, and it says, the menu drops down. Hey, the resistance is 26. Normal in an intubated patient is 8 centimeters of water per liter per second. Reasons that airway resistance may be increased include kink tube, secretions in the airway, bronchospasm, occluded HME, things that, again, we're working with Zoll, which is, again, makes a ventilator for the military and concentrates on pre-hospital care. We call smart help. And smart help right now is probably more useful than closed loop control.
Yeah, you're talking about open loop decision support. That's the way to go. Right. That's where the money should be. Again, it gets back to education and leveling the playing field. And that's well within our reach. But why don't manufacturers do that? Because they don't see any return on investment, right?
Well, plus they also, FDA will say, well, you're dictating practice. You're practicing medicine. And so then the manufacturers go, I don't want to do that.
So from an international standpoint, I can tell you the ventilators I am involved with do exactly what you say. There are prompts, and actually the rest of the world wants that more because there's such an inundation of tender bids. And what happens in the international world is whoever's in with that country gets their spec put into the system, and that's what's put out as they're going to purchase it. So the incoming group has to basically match that spec. So what you see is a lot of growth and creep of terms and names and things that make ventilators crazy, as Rob knows from the taxonomy of ventilation. But we see this growth, and what is appreciated internationally is something that follows a basic breath delivery nomenclature and has information and is clear and easy to use without error. And physicians, that's what they're asking for. They want to know about all the other things, and does it have this and does it have that? But that's usually, honestly, the ventilator people playing with each other. And the physician internationally wants a reliable product that can do critical care ventilation. And unfortunately, all the ventilators purchased and donated don't do that.
That specmanship is the reason that all ventilator manufacturers still make ventilators that can set the tidal volume at 2 liters. Again, I don't understand why we wouldn't. I used to joke that if defibrillators were like ventilators, the final click to the right, would be electrocution. Because think if you put somebody on a 2 liter tidal volume, it's craziness. But I'm not sure how to fix that problem.
I've been asked internationally, how come, and I can't remember which ventilator did it, but the ideal body weight setting is 200 or something, way up there. It might be a McKay that has it really super high. And how come these ventilators here only go to 200 and this goes to 400? Well, because if you put it to 400, the tidal volume is going to be that 2 liters. And so some people have self-limited, but it's hard because you can lose business that way.
But sorry, I was going to jump in for a couple of minutes, Steve. Otherwise, you'll take over all of our time. But you're right though, guys, about modes. I mean, we have all these modes of ventilation, right? And the average clinician still uses the old modes, SIMV or whatever. So we haven't really done much. My own belief is really the tools in the ventilator. Can we get information out of the ventilator where the clinician can look at that and say, right, based on this is what we should do. Now, Giorgio Iotti, when he was involved way back with ASV, and what they were doing, they were taking a number of patients, put them on ASV, they had COPD, ARDS, normal lungs, looking at the numbers, then going, so right, this is what the ventilator is doing, for example, measuring expiratory time constant or whatever, and then going back to a manual ventilation mode to try at least for the clinicians to say, hey, the ventilator's guiding us. But it's also too, my own thought is, for example, PEEP. People say, oh, we use 5 of PEEP, right? No RCT said 5 of PEEP was the right number, but if you can convince people that having optimal PEEP, whatever that means, having a tool to show that would be important, yes. And some people do and some don't. Now you come along and say, well, maybe TPP might be a better way. How many clinicians are very good at putting esophageal balloons in? Doesn't happen. All these things, it doesn't happen, right? Maybe better, but they still don't, it doesn't work.
I agree, Graeme. I think that argues for what we're talking about, which is not more sophistication, but presentation of data in a way which helps the bedside clinician make the right decision.
Correct.
That, along with understanding what the technology does. There's probably 50 different modes. Why is that? There are reasons for that, and you need to know which mode serves the goal of ventilation. There's only 3 basic goals: safety, comfort, and liberation, right? My goals of life. I want to get liberated from this place.
Well, I think that's a good place to liberate the audience, and I appreciate everybody, and thank you, Richard, for joining us tonight. And you're now on the list, so you're welcome to any of these subjects that seem interesting to you. And we appreciate everybody's time here again before. So everybody breathe easy. Thanks again.
See you guys.
Thanks, guys. Thanks, Rich. Much appreciated.
No problem.